This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Social and environmental. I've got in my hand a copy of the Devro accounts. Social and environmental. Let me check and see where it is. Corporate Social Responsibility Report. Paragraph 1, being a responsible business. You can actually read about this on the company's website, www.devro.com. Safety. Our aim is to do everything safely, and we're working towards a target of 0 injuries. How we did in 2011. Our environmental policy. Carbon dioxide, water usage, solid waste, environmental management systems. Our Czech factory proceeded to obtain ISO 14001 registration, and we're working to achieve similar registrations on other sites. Here are our targets for carbon dioxide, water and solid waste. And if you look at the table there on page 17 of Devro, 2011 was an improvement in 2 of the 3 categories. We increased solid waste, but that was due primarily, it says, due primarily to increased production. In 2015, these are our targets, 75%. The carbon dioxide is nearly there, it's only 79.3, our target is 75.6. And the carbon dioxide says it puts us well on target, the detailed information puts us well on target, but well on the way to achieving our 2015 target. Health and safety, where's that? Safety and charitable contributions. They say they're a corporate social responsible organisation. Payment employees. We place considerable value on the involvement of our employees, and we continue to keep them informed on matters affecting them as employees, and on various factors affecting the performance of the group. Charitable and political contributions, I'm on page 20. To local community groups, they contributed £38,000 compared with £29,000 last year. Schools and colleges, £13,000. Healthcare and medical, oh, look at that. We've gone from £14,000 last year to £7,000 this year. Applications for employment by disabled persons are always fully considered, bearing in mind the aptitudes of the applicant concerned. In the event of members of staff becoming disabled, every effort is made to ensure that their employment is continued and appropriate training is arranged. So no discrimination. A statement of directors' responsibilities, a statement of corporate governance, a statement pursuant to the disclosure and transparency rules. It's a wonderful set of accounts. It illustrates everything that you could possibly want to. And 1 or 2 little areas where there is a little question raised, but all these reports, this 90-page document, is a wonderful example, particularly for P1 as well as P7, of matters to be included within the book, which is generally called the financial statements, but which includes a lot of other things. It's the annual report and accounts, it says on the front of the document. It's worthwhile spending some time downloading it, reading it, borrowing it from me, whatever. I can see many of you in the room are interested in this, but I only have 4 copies, and therefore I'm going to have to ask for them back. But I've no doubt that when you rush home this evening, you'll log on, and having read the BBC News, you'll then download the Devro accounts and read those. Page 97, social and environmental. Here's a definition for you. Here's a definition that you could usefully bring into many auditing answers. It's a management tool comprising a systematic, documented, periodic and objective evaluation of how well organisations' management equipment are performing with the edge of contributing to safeguarding the environment by facilitating management control of environmental practices and assessing compliance with entity policies, which would include meeting regulatory requirements and applicable standards. I could read that again in order to emphasise how important it is to learn that definition. I foresee that of the thousands of people doing this exam in just 10 weeks' time, no one will remember that definition. Except you. You'll probably go home this evening, and having read the BBC News and downloaded the Devereux account, you'll then set about learning the definition of an environmental audit. Environmental issues cannot be ignored by external auditors. This is, come on, let's be honest, this is new. This is fashion, but it's a praiseable fashion. It is a fashion which is praiseworthy, that people should be aware of the environment and the safety and integrity of the planet, and the environmental issues are important. They never were important when I was a student. No one ever paid attention to it. In terms of individually we might have done, but it was never part of external auditors' considerations. But it should be now. And it certainly should be within the considerations of the client companies and all of those who work for firms and companies other than auditors. You should be fully aware of the need to protect the environment. And I've no doubt you do. I understand that some of you work for a chewing gum manufacturer. I presume that your sales in Singapore are minimal, on the basis that chewing gum is an illegal commodity in Singapore. And might I say how delightful it must be to walk along the Singapore pavements without fear of stepping into second-hand chewing gum. Why is it that people feel it necessary, having finished their chewing gum, why do they feel it necessary to stick it to the underside of a desk, such that when I lean on a desk like this, I suddenly find that my fingers are touching second-hand chewing gum? Is it some sort of sexual perversion that people get from sticking their chewing gum to the underside of a desk, or even putting it on a seat, hoping that somebody will not notice and they'll sit down and spoil their clothes? What is it? What is it that makes you do that? Not you, I'm not looking at anyone in particular here. What is it that makes other people stick their chewing gum to the bottom of a desk?
Provide a second life.
To provide a second life. There used to be a song, it was a very popular hit record in the UK many years ago. The first line of the song was, "Does your chewing gum lose its flavour on the bedpost overnight?" So you're sitting there in the evening, chewing away, reading a book. You decide to go to sleep, so you put your chewing gum on the bedpost so it's there for you in the morning. Does it lose its flavour on the bedpost overnight? I think that made it to number one. But I'm saying, we're talking many years ago, it made it to number one in the music charts in the UK. Environmental issues, I'm back on 97, I've stopped my little digression. Environmental issues cannot be ignored by external auditors. The reason is that there are sometimes a direct effect where we are in conflict with environmental issues. For instance, it could be that we face fines or penalties where we pollute. In the UK, the National Rivers Authority has the authority to take people and companies to court where they are discovered to have been putting waste into the rivers. So where a manufacturing company is discharging wastewater into a river and the wastewater is not purified, it contains detergents or it contains toxic acids and other toxic material, then the National Rivers Authority will take them to court and prosecute them, and they face fines and penalties, and if they continue to do it, then they face closure. So it is an important matter. There was a case recently, I say recently, about 10 years ago, of a company in Romania. It was a mining company, and they use a particular type of acid in the production of gold or platinum, whatever valuable element was being extracted from the earth. And they used, I think it's strychnine or maybe arsenic, and they discovered that one of their containers, a big drum of arsenic, had leaked, and 100,000 litres or whatever it was of poison, toxic waste and acid had leaked into the River Danube. And the Romanian authorities sought and were granted, I have a feeling it's something like $1 million of compensation for the environmental damage to the River Danube and all its wildlife. Now, I was subsequently talking to, it was an Australian mining company. I met an Australian miner on one of my visits overseas. I met an Australian miner who was involved in exactly this. And he said, yes, he knows of the case, but the effect of that leakage into the Danube would have dissipated, would have disappeared within probably about 100 metres of the River Danube. It would be so dilute by the end of 100 metres that you would never notice it. Well, it was his contention, it was his expertise opinion, but the Romanian government managed to get $1 million out of it. I'm not even going to suggest that the $1 million which was awarded to the Romanian government possibly found its way into Romanian politicians' possession. I'm not even going to mention that as a possibility. Wasn't there a case also in, yes there was, in Belarus? There's a river comes out of Belarus and flows into Latvia, and they had the same situation. And I have a feeling that Latvians tried to recover some money from the Belarusian government. The river Daugava, which runs through the middle of Riga, starts in Belarus, and I believe that there was a similar leakage there, but I don't know what the outcome was. Potential impact on the financial statements may arise from application of environmental laws and regulations, this polluting of rivers, the operation of processes that may cause pollution, and therefore we could be faced with the need to change our processes, which could and will affect our cash flows and could put the company into financial difficulties. The holding of an interest in land and buildings, that when we have bought some property, some land and buildings, and now we discover that the land and buildings has historically been contaminated, and the value of the land and or buildings is therefore much reduced. One of the elements is asbestos. That if you buy a building and it looks structurally sound, when you start knocking down walls to rearrange the inside, and you discover that the walls are asbestos lined. Isn't there a hospital, there's something about Lassa fever, I think, an infection called Lassa fever, and it resides in hospital water tanks and is developed in hospital water tanks. It develops itself. You may find that your water supply is contaminated, and it can and will involve excessive amounts of money being spent to clean up that water supply or remove the asbestos, which is damaging to respiratory breathing systems within people. Dependence on a major customer segment whose business is threatened by environmental pressures. Environmental and social pressures, not just environmental. But yeah, okay, if your client company is located in Brazil, I heard this morning, that there's a report that the increase in deforestation cases in Brazil or in the Amazon area has increased by 26% in the last 4 months. They took satellite pictures in November, they compared them with satellite pictures yesterday, and they've determined that an area the size of Greater London has been deforested in the Brazilian and the Amazonian Valley. And if you're dependent upon wood and timber from the Amazonian Valley, and I think I'm fair enough in saying that the 3 Baltic states are pretty dependent on timber production, on wood production. If it were the case ever that the 3 Baltic states what are they, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, if it were ever the case that their governments were to say no more deforestation, then the economy of those three countries is going to suffer quite dramatically. Auditors do not have specific knowledge of environmental matters. You're auditors, you're not necessarily environmental specialists. But in planning the audit, we should obtain sufficient knowledge of the business to understand the events, transactions and practices that could have a significant effect on the financial statements. These three areas that Devro talk about, carbon dioxide emissions, water usage, and waste production for landfill or incineration. These are measures which are sensibly used by any organisation. Carbon dioxide is killing the planet. Carbon monoxide is killing the people on the planet. Carbon dioxide is killing the planet and pushing a hole in the ozone layer, allowing the sun's rays directly to affect us, and we're all going to burn up. We're all going to be killed. That's a guarantee. We'll all die in a number of years' time. Difficulties in measuring social and environmental performance. It's accepted that measuring social and environmental performance is difficult. We can have different measures, direct, relative, indexed, aggregated and weighted. Direct, the number of kilos of contaminant emitted. That's okay. I can understand how that would be relatively easy to work out. Relative, data compared to another parameter, the number of kilos of contaminant compared with the kilo of a product produced. And that's what we had of Endeavour, isn't it? The number of injuries compared with million hours worked. Indexed, measured over a period of time. Again, we've got it in Endeavour with water, waste production and carbon dioxide emissions. Aggregated, information of the same type but from different sources, expressed as a combined value. And weighted, information modified by applying a factor which relates to its significance. And usually we provide information by way of disclosure in the financial statements. I'm going to steal from you now. It's actually 12:30. It's time for lunch, but given that we've only got a page and a bit to cover, I'm going to finish that before lunch. Unless any of you have a lunch date, in which case we'll stop now and just finish a page and a half after. We'll carry on. Is anybody objecting to the fact that we'll just carry on for this page and a half? No objections, then we'll carry on. Controls over social and environmental risks. Where environmental matters represent significant risk, then they may fall within the ambit of the internal control system. They may fall within the coverage of the internal control system. Management can achieve control over environmental entities with low exposure to environmental risk or similar companies. Think about regional offices. I mentioned chewing gum. Regional offices of our chewing gum company. I imagine that the regional office here, for instance, has got very little exposure to environmental risk. It does say at the bottom of emails, doesn't it, think before you print. But other than that, certainly me, when I had my business, if I printed something and it was wrong, then I didn't just screw the paper up. I'd only printed it on one side. I used the reverse side of it. So I'm saving the planet and saving the trees. Think again about Big Four companies, Big Four audit firms. There seems to be very little risk, in my mind, very little risk of environmental pollution coming out of PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I don't see that you're not polluting the planet, you may be polluting the minds of people that read the results of your work. That was said as a joke, of course, that was not intended to be serious. So entities with low exposure to environmental risk, or small companies, they'll probably monitor and control environmental matters, or it might just be a natural thing for the employees of the organisation to be environmentally conscious. Some entities that operate in industries with high exposure may design and operate a separate internal control subsystem, the Environmental Management System, the EMAS, Environmental Eco-Management. Other entities design and operate all their controls within an integrated control system. Policies and procedures relating to accounting, environmental and other matters are all part of the overall system and policy of the company. Devro, I think, is an example. And some entities may have obtained registration for the environmental control. The Czech company of Devro, the Czech subsidiary, has managed to get itself ISO 14001, and it says in the accounts, the annual report, that other companies within the group are aiming to get that ISO 14000. In fact, just as I walked into the office, just around the corner on the wall, just out of the door here, there is a certificate that says that they are, I think it's environmentally aware, or that they have got the certificate that shows that they are, ISO 9001, which I think was the earlier version of the 14001, is just around the corner on the wall. As you're going out now for lunch, all of you, just have a look at that and check that I'm not lying. Substantive procedures. They may perform substantive testing to obtain evidence in relation to environmental matters. It's not intended that all of the procedures listed below will be appropriate in any particular case, and you therefore need to tailor any auditing answer in the exam to fit the circumstances. In many cases, the auditor may judge it unnecessary to perform any of these procedures. Documentary review. Consider minutes from meetings of directors, audit committees, or other subcommittees. Did I not read in Devro that there was an environmental subcommittee? I seem to remember that there was. Consider publicly available information regarding any existing or possible future environmental matters. And where relevant, consider reports by World Health Organization, reports by Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth. These are all organizations whose focus, NGOs, whose focus is on protecting the planet and protecting the wildlife, the flora, the plants and flowers and growing things, and the fauna, the living animals that we share the planet with. Internal audit reports and other internal reports dealing with environmental matters. Reports issued by and correspondence with the regulatory authorities. I don't know, I'm not sufficiently aware in your country of any regulatory authorities, but I've no doubt you do know them. Publicly available registers or plans for restoration of soil contamination and correspondence with entities' lawyers. And that comes into P2, it comes into F7 as well, doesn't it? Where a company will make provision for the restoration costs where they have to clean up the site that they have now closed. If you have a local nuclear processing plant which is about to be closed, when it is closed there will be a process and a period of restoring the land to its former beauty. There was an oil pipe that I remember being laid in the UK. I had to drive over it on a number of occasions, and to drive over the area where the pipe was being laid. And it's normally a requirement of the people laying the pipe that they restore the farmland that they've gone through to its former condition. So they have to import soil, where they get that from I don't know, have to import soil or replace the soil and replant the trees in order that their land is put back into its former condition. That has an impact on financial accounts, and therefore the auditor needs to consider it. And finally, correspondence with the entity's lawyers to determine whether there are potentially any legal actions against the company requiring the company to restore or pay fines or penalties because of pollution. And finally, at the bottom of page 98, before we get on to 99, the last page, obtain written representations from management that they have considered the effects of environmental matters and that they're not aware of any material liabilities which may exist, or contingencies arising from environmental matters, including those from illegal or possibly illegal. And if we have committed any illegal acts, this should be in the environmental report. It should say that we do our best not to pollute the environment, but would have been 4 instances during the year where pollution, where something broke down and as a result pollution resulted, and we've taken steps to remedy it, to make sure it doesn't happen again. That the management is not aware of any environmental matters which may result in material impairment of assets. Or if we are of such matters, then we have disclosed to the auditor all the relevant facts of that matter, so the auditors have got full knowledge. Page 99 of direct consequence to the statement of financial position is the concept of asset impairment. Inquire about any planned changes in assets, for example, in response to changes in environmental legislation or change in business strategy, and their impact on the valuation. Make inquiry. And if the company has made provision for site restoration, then as auditors you need to check the documentation, look at the director's minutes, discuss with management, confirm the computation of the present value of the provision and make sure that the provision has been properly accounted for in the financial statements. This is the auditing element of the accounting aspect. For any asset impairments related to environmental matters which did exist in previous periods, consider whether the assumptions underlying a write-down continue to be appropriate. How are you going to set about auditing this environmental matters thing? What's your first step? Last year's file. And then discussions with the management about anything new which has occurred or any change in the situation. Discuss with any internal auditors. Discuss with the audit committee whether anything has been brought to their attention. Read the news to see whether there's any change in legislation or change in regulation. It comes out as common sense. But up at the start of your answer is going to be, the auditor should obtain a thorough understanding of the company's policies and procedures with reference to environmental pollution, environmental matters. These are normal, routine things that you can bring into auditing answers. And finally, liabilities, provisions and contingencies. Inquire about policies and procedures to identify liabilities, provisions, contingencies. Inquire about events or conditions which may give rise to these things, particularly penalties which potentially are going to be awarded against us, or penalties which have already been awarded, or possible penalties arising from breach of law. If you are aware as a company that you are polluting atmosphere or polluting water, would you disclose that if nobody else knew? Yeah, you would. As a corporate social responsible organisation, you would actually admit it and actually say you would already as a company, if you knew, you would already as a company have notified the regulatory authority and said, we have already or are already taking steps to prevent it happening again. And that will actually reduce the penalty which may be imposed against you. You will still have a penalty, but at least it will be reduced. But if you're found out and you haven't disclosed, and you will be found out, then the penalty will be substantially greater. How will you be found out? Because one of your employees will whistle blow. One of your employees will blow the whistle on you. You guarantee it. It will happen. One of your employees will blow the whistle, and then the regulatory authorities come along and, you have to hold your hands up and plead guilty. So the better thing to do is to volunteer the information. Penalties or possible penalties arising from breaches of law and regulation, or claims or possible claims for environmental damage. Property abandoned, purchased or closed during the period, inquire about requirements or intention. It may be that we don't have an obligation, but we do have a reputation. So we have a constructive obligation to clear up the site after we've left it or after we are proposed leaving. If property is sold during the period and in prior periods, think about any liability relating to environmental matters which we have kept, even though we have sold it. It may be by contract or by law that we are still responsible to an extent for site restoration. Accounting estimates, you need to audit them. Liabilities, provisions, contingencies. related to environmental matters, consider whether the assumptions underlying the estimates continue to be appropriate, and review the adequacy of any disclosure. As an auditor, review the completeness, adequacy, accuracy of the management's disclosure within the financial statements of these environmental matters. Page 100 is like your minds, blank.